What happens when a racist cop accuses his son's black friend of stealing, but stops cold when his father, the police commissioner, arrives? Officer Rick Dawson, a 42-year-old police officer, had spent 18 years in the police force. He was known for being strict, short-tempered, and deeply set in his ways. His reputation among his colleagues was mixed. Some respected his toughness, while others whispered about his bias. He followed the rules to the letter, but only when it suited him. Rick had a 13-year-old son, Jake, from a failed marriage. He never spoke about Jake's mother, nor did he show much warmth. Raising Jake alone wasn't easy, but Rick kept his emotions buried, believing toughness was the only way to survive in this world. One Saturday morning, Rick Dawson sat at the kitchen table, drinking black coffee and reading the newspaper. His 13-year-old son, Jake, walked in, still wearing his basketball shorts from practice. "Dad, my friend is coming over," Jake said, grabbing an apple from the counter. Rick barely looked up. "Who?" "His name's Jordan. We play on the same team." Rick frowned slightly, but didn't say anything. Jake rarely had friends over. He was usually quiet, spending most of his time on his phone or playing video games. "He's a good guy," Jake added, sensing his father's hesitation. As the evening sun cast long shadows over the yard, the doorbell rang. Rick looked up from the TV, hearing Jake rush to answer it. Standing at the door was Jordan, a tall, lean 14-year-old with dark brown skin and short curls. He had a friendly smile and wore a basketball jersey with faded jeans. "Hey Jake," Jordan said, bumping fists with him. Rick stayed on the couch, eyeing the boy from a distance. He wasn't expecting someone like Jordan. "Dad, this is Jordan," Jake said, glancing back. Rick gave a stiff nod, but said nothing. Rick watched the boys with a cold stare. He didn't like this. Jake had never brought a black friend home before. Jordan seemed polite, but that didn't matter to Rick. He crossed his arms and stayed quiet, his jaw tightening. Jake laughed at something Jordan said, completely unaware of his father's mood. Rick exhaled sharply and stood up. "Don't stay up too late," he muttered before walking to his room. Jake barely noticed. Rick's silence was nothing new. Rick couldn't hide his disappointment. He watched the boys laugh and talk as if everything was normal. It wasn't. His son was making friends with the wrong kind of people. He clenched his fists, took a deep breath, and called out, "Jake, come to my room. Now." Jake sighed but obeyed, glancing at Jordan. "I'll be right back," he muttered before heading down the hall. As he stepped into his father's room, Rick shut the door halfway but left it open just enough. He wanted Jordan to hear every word. "Sit," Rick ordered. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, confused. Rick folded his arms and glared at his son. "What do you think you're doing?" Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" Rick's eyes narrowed. "That kid, Jordan. Why are you hanging out with him?" Jake crossed his arms. "He's my friend." Rick scoffed. "Your friend? Listen to me, Jake. You should be making friends with your own kind. White kids, not black kids." Jake's face hardened. "Why? Jordan's a good guy." Rick shook his head. "Black folks are always up to no good. I see it every day at my job. Getting arrested for stealing, peddling drugs, carrying firearms, crime after crime. And you bring one into my house." Jake's hands curled into fists. "Jordan's not like that." Rick's voice rose. "You don't know that. They act nice, but sooner or later, they show their true colors. I've spent 18 years in the force, and I know what I'm talking about." Jake's jaw tightened. "You don't know him." Rick pointed a finger at him. "I'm disappointed in you, Jake. You should be smarter than this." Silence hung between them. Jake's face burned with anger, but he said nothing. He stood up, turned, and walked out. Jordan was still in the living room. Jordan sat on the couch, his hands resting on his knees, but his mind was far away. He had only been in Jake's house for 10 minutes, yet he had already heard more than enough. Every word from Jake's father stung. The man barely knew him, yet he spoke as if he were a criminal. And to think he was a cop, an officer of the law, someone who was supposed to be fair and just. Jordan had always believed that police officers were meant to protect everyone, but now, sitting there listening to Rick Dawson's harsh words, that belief shattered. His heart ached, and he could feel hot tears welling up in his eyes. But he refused to let them fall. He wouldn't give Rick Dawson the satisfaction. Taking a deep breath, he blinked away the pain and forced himself to act normal, even though nothing felt normal anymore. Jake walked back into the living room, trying to act like everything was fine. He saw Jordan sitting quietly on the couch, eyes fixed on the floor. Without a word, he grabbed a game controller and tossed the other one to Jordan. "Come on, let's play," Jake said, forcing a smile. Jordan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He didn't want to seem weak. He picked up the controller, and soon the game filled the screen. They started playing, fingers moving quickly, eyes locked on the action. Laughter broke through the silence as they got into the game. Jordan cracked a joke, and Jake laughed so hard he nearly dropped his controller. For a few minutes, the tension from earlier seemed to fade. It was just two friends playing, having fun, forgetting everything else. Then it happened. Jordan's controller suddenly stopped working. His character froze on the screen, while Jake's kept moving. He pressed the buttons again, harder this time, but nothing happened. "Hey Jake, my controller's not working," Jordan said, trying to keep his voice calm. Jake glanced at him, then shrugged. "No big deal. Probably just the battery." He paused the game, grabbed a fresh set of batteries from the table, and swapped them out. "This should fix it." Jordan nodded, but as soon as he pressed the buttons again, the controller remained unresponsive. His stomach tightened. He tried again, nothing. "Still not working?" Jake asked, frowning. Jordan swallowed hard. "Yeah, still nothing." Jake sighed. "Weird. Let me see." But Jordan barely heard him. His heart pounded as he clenched the useless controller in his hands. "Not now," he thought. As Jake and Jordan struggled to fix the controller, Rick walked into the living room. His sharp eyes scanned the boys, then the paused game on the screen. He noticed the way they were fumbling with the controller and frowned. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice firm. Jake looked up. "The controller stopped working," he said. "I changed the batteries, but it's still not working." Rick crossed his arms. He took a step closer. "Who was using it when it stopped working?" Jordan felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew where this was going. He swallowed and glanced at Jake, hoping he would answer first. Jake hesitated, then said, "Jordan was." Rick's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. He looked down at Jordan, then at the controller in his hands. Silence filled the room, heavy and uncomfortable. Rick let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. His jaw tightened as he crossed his arms, staring at Jordan with cold eyes. "I knew it," he muttered, his voice laced with frustration. "Of course, it had to be you." Jordan shifted uncomfortably, gripping the useless controller in his hands. Jake frowned, sensing the change in his father's mood. Rick didn't hold back. "Do you know how hard I work to provide for my son? Day and night, busting my ass so he can have the things he deserves." He scoffed, pacing the room. "And now, some kid whose parents probably don't even have real jobs, comes into my house and breaks what I bought with my hard-earned money." Jake's face turned red with embarrassment. "Dad, it's just a controller. It's not that serious." Rick shot him a glare. "Not that serious? You think I have money to waste? Do you know how much that thing costs? And now it's broken just like that." He turned back to Jordan, his eyes filled with disdain. "People like you don't understand what it means to work for something. You take and take, but you never earn anything yourselves." Jordan clenched his fists. He wanted to defend himself, to say something, anything, but the lump in his throat wouldn't let him speak. Rick scoffed again. "Typical," he said. "No apology, no explanation. Just sitting there, acting innocent." Jake stood up, his face tense. "Dad, stop." Rick ignored him. "You break something, and now my son has to suffer for it. You think that's fair?" His voice dripped with anger, his words cutting deep. Jordan looked down, his chest heavy. He had never felt so unwelcome in his entire life. Jordan swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "I'm sorry, Mr. Dawson," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He hated apologizing for something that wasn't his fault, but he just wanted the tension to end. Rick stared at him for a moment, then let out a heavy sigh. "Yeah, whatever," Rick muttered, shaking his head. He seemed to lose some of his anger, but the irritation in his eyes remained. "Just be more careful next time." With that, he turned away, rubbing his temples as if exhausted by the conversation. For a few minutes, the room was silent. Jake and Jordan didn't say much, both feeling the weight of what had just happened. The air still felt thick, but at least the argument was over. Rick eventually walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and grabbed a cold beer. He twisted the cap off and took a long sip, letting out a slow breath. Jake glanced at Jordan. "Let's just watch a movie instead," he suggested. Jordan nodded, grateful for the distraction. He didn't feel like playing anymore. Jake grabbed the remote and scrolled through the options. They settled on an action movie, something loud enough to fill the silence. As the opening scene played, they tried to relax, but the tension lingered, sitting between them like an invisible wall. Even with the noise from the TV, the night no longer felt the same. As the movie played, Rick sat in his chair, sipping another beer. He wasn't really watching the screen. His eyes kept drifting toward Jordan. The way he sat, the way he laughed, the way he talked, it all irritated him. Halfway through the movie, Jake made a joke about one of the scenes. Jordan laughed, shaking his head. "Man, you're stupid," he joked, nudging Jake's shoulder. But Rick didn't laugh. He leaned forward, his expression dark. "You always talk like that." Jordan blinked, confused. "Like what?" Rick scoffed. "That slang. The way you and your kind talk, all loud, all uneducated." He took another sip of beer. "Do you even go to school?" Jordan felt his face heat up. "I do," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. Rick smirked. "Really? Because from the way you sound, I doubt you even read books. Do they even teach grammar where you go to school?" Jake's smile faded. "Dad, what the hell?" Rick ignored him, still looking at Jordan. "It's always the same, fast talking, bad pronunciation, and acting like it's cool. You think people will take you seriously if you keep talking like that?" Jordan clenched his fists, but he refused to give Rick the reaction he wanted. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I talk just fine." Rick chuckled, shaking his head. "If you say so." He took another swig of beer before muttering, "I don't want that ghetto behavior rubbing off on my son." The room fell silent again. The movie kept playing, but the fun had disappeared. Jordan sat stiffly, staring at the screen, but he wasn't watching anymore. His chest felt tight, and his hands clenched into fists on his lap. He wanted to defend himself, to say something, but what was the point? Rick had already decided what he thought of him. Jake glanced at Jordan, his expression tense. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he didn't. The weight of his father's words lingered in the air, suffocating and thick. Jordan had had enough. His chest felt tight, and his hands curled into fists at his sides. He wouldn't be able to take one more second of this. Standing up abruptly, he took a deep breath and said, "I think I should go." His voice was quiet, but firm. Jake's eyes widened. "What?" "No man, come on. It's late." Jordan shook his head. "It's fine. I'll call my dad to come pick me up." He pulled out his phone and scrolled to his father's number. His fingers trembled slightly as he pressed the call button. Jake glanced at his father, then back at Jordan. He could see the hurt in his friend's face, the way his shoulders tensed. "Just stay okay?" he tried again. "Forget about it. Let's finish the movie." Jordan forced a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't worry about it, Jake. I'll be fine." He turned away slightly as the phone rang in his ear. After a few seconds, he heard his father's deep voice answer on the other end. "Dad, can you come get me?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Yeah, I'm fine. I just want to go home." Rick sat back in his chair, watching the scene unfold with a smug expression. He didn't say anything, but his face said enough. He had won. Jake clenched his jaw, his fists tightening on his lap. He wanted to say something, to stand up for his friend, but the words wouldn't come out. All he could do was sit there, helpless, as Jordan waited for his father to arrive. Rick leaned back in his chair, still watching Jordan with that same smug expression. But then, something caught his eye, Jordan's wristwatch. His gaze narrowed as he focused on it. It looked familiar. Too familiar. Rick's chest tightened. It was the exact same wristwatch he had given Jake for his 13th birthday, just a few months ago. A sleek design, silver with a black leather strap. He remembered buying it at a high-end store, spending $650 on it. It wasn't the kind of watch just any kid had. His grip on his beer tightened. How did Jordan have that watch? Rick's jaw tightened as he set his beer down. He leaned forward slightly, eyes locked on Jordan's wrist. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. "Before you leave, don't forget to take off that watch and give it back to Jake," he said, his tone almost casual. Jordan looked up, confused. "What?" Rick gestured toward the watch. "Jake's watch. You're wearing it. Just leave it here before you go." Jordan blinked, then glanced down at his wrist. Realization hit, and he let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh, this?" he said, lifting his arm. "This isn't Jake's watch. It's mine." Rick's eyes darkened. "Yours?" Jordan nodded. "Yeah, I got it as a gift." Rick didn't respond right away. He just stared, his expression unreadable. The air in the room grew tense again, thick with something dangerous. Rick's eyes burned with suspicion as he sat up straight, his grip tightening on the armrest. His voice rose, sharp and accusing. "Is this some kind of joke?" he asked, his anger bubbling to the surface. "Are you trying to steal from us?" Jordan's face twisted in shock. "What? No." Rick scoffed. "That is Jake's watch. I got it for him. What do you mean it's a gift? His voice was filled with disbelief. Jordan opened his mouth to speak, but Rick cut him off. You liar, he spat. Who would give you such an expensive gift? A watch like that costs more than what most people like you could afford. Jordan's hands curled into fists. His chest felt tight, his heart pounding. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. No matter what he said, Rick had already made up his mind about him. Jake sat up, his face tense with frustration. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It's true, Dad, he said firmly. Jordan has the exact same watch. Rick shot him a sharp look. Don't lie for him, Jake. I'm not lying. Jake snapped. His dad got it for him just last week after he saw mine. He thought it would be cool if we had matching watches. It's his, I swear. Rick's eyes flickered between his son and Jordan. His jaw clenched, his fingers tapping against his beer bottle. He didn't look convinced. Jordan exhaled, shaking his head. I told you, he muttered. Rick didn't answer right away. His face remained stiff, unreadable. The room was thick with tension again, and Jake could feel his heart pounding. He had never had to defend a friend like this before, especially not to his own father. Rick's face twisted with anger as he shook his head. His voice was cold, sharp. You think you both can fool me? He said, his eyes burning with suspicion. I can't believe you're defending a thief, Jake. I raised you better than this. Jake's mouth opened, but before he could respond, Rick turned his attention back to Jordan. His gaze was hard, filled with disgust. If you don't return that watch right now, I'm going to have to take drastic measures, Rick warned. You forget that I'm a cop. He took a step closer, his presence intimidating. Jordan swallowed, his body tense. I didn't steal anything, he said, his voice steady despite the anger rising inside him. Rick scoffed. You must be very bold, coming into my house and trying to steal from me. There's no helping you people. The room fell into silence, thick with tension, as Jordan's fists clenched at his sides. Rick's eyes narrowed, his voice dripping with suspicion. If it isn't Jake's watch, then where is Jake's watch? He looked from Jake to Jordan, his anger rising. Where is my son's watch? Jake felt a chill run through him. He knew Jordan wasn't lying, but now doubt was creeping in. He turned and hurried to his room. I'll get it, he said quickly. Moments later, he pulled open his drawer, expecting to see his watch sitting where he always kept it. But it wasn't there. His heart started to pound. He checked again, pushing things aside, looking under his books, in his closet, on his desk, nothing. His stomach tightened as he ran back to the living room. I can't find it, he admitted, his voice uneasy. Rick let out a bitter laugh. Of course you can't, he said coldly. And we all know why. His eyes locked onto Jordan. We'll find it, Jake said quickly, ignoring his father's words. He started searching the living room, pulling open all the drawers, his school bags, looking under the table. Jordan joined him, checking the corners of the room, the shelves, anywhere it might have fallen. Minutes passed. 5 long, tense minutes of searching, nothing. The watch was gone. Rick leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Well, he said slowly, shaking his head. Looks like I was right all along. Jordan's innocence was hanging by a thread. He could feel the weight of Rick's gaze pressing down on him. His breath came out shaky. No matter what he said, no matter how hard they searched, he knew Rick had already made up his mind. Rick had finally had enough. His patience was gone, his suspicions confirmed in his mind. He reached for the handcuffs on his belt and took a step toward Jordan. That's it, he said, his voice sharp. I'm placing you under arrest for theft. Jordan's eyes widened in shock. What? I didn't take anything. Jake jumped between them, his arms outstretched. Dad, stop. You're making a mistake. But Rick ignored him. Move, Jake. I'm done playing games. This kid needs to learn that actions have consequences. Before he could grab Jordan, a loud knock on the door made them all freeze. The knock came again, firm and authoritative. Rick frowned, irritated at the interruption. He exchanged a quick glance with Jake before stepping toward the door. When he opened it, he was met with a sight that made him straighten up immediately. Standing on his doorstep, dressed in his official uniform, was Commissioner Daniel Carter, his boss. Rick's breath caught in his throat. He quickly composed himself, giving a respectful nod. Sir, he said, surprised. I wasn't expecting you. Is there an emergency at the office? Commissioner Carter's expression was unreadable, his deep-set eyes scanning Rick's face. No, Officer Rick. I didn't know you lived here, he said simply. I'm here to pick up my son, Jordan. Rick's stomach dropped. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. He turned his head slowly, looking back at Jordan, who was staring at him with quiet defiance. The room felt painfully silent. Jordan's father, the police commissioner. Rick swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had just tried to arrest his boss's son, accused him, humiliated him, insulted him right in his own home. And now, the truth stood right in front of him, staring him in the face. Jake looked between his father and the commissioner, his own expression filled with shock. Rick's hands, still hovering near his belt, slowly fell to his sides. His face drained of color as the weight of the situation hit him. For the first time that night, Rick Dawson was completely speechless. Just then, a sharp cry of relief came from inside the house. "I found it!" Jake shouted. His voice was loud, filled with urgency. Rick turned quickly, watching as Jake rushed toward them, holding up the missing watch. "It was stuck in the sofa cushions," Jake said, slightly out of breath. "Right where Jordan and I were sitting earlier when we were playing games. It must have fallen in when we were trying to fix the controller." Silence filled the room. Jordan closed his eyes for a second, exhaling slowly. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but hearing Jake confirm it made his chest feel lighter. Jake turned to his father, his expression full of frustration. "See, Dad? He didn't take anything." Rick felt his face burn with embarrassment. His mind raced, trying to piece together a way to salvage what was left of his dignity. He had accused Jordan, insulted him, tried to have him arrested, all while the truth was sitting right under his nose. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. How could he ever fix this? He slowly turned his gaze to Jordan, but the boy's expression was unreadable. There was no satisfaction, no gloating, just a quiet disappointment that somehow felt worse than anger. Then Rick looked at Commissioner Carter, who stood tall, his expression cold and unreadable. The commissioner finally broke the silence, his voice calm but firm. "Jordan," he said, turning to his son, "is everything okay?" Jordan hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Yeah, Dad," he said, though his voice lacked its usual energy. "Everything's fine." Rick swallowed hard, his throat dry. Everything was not fine. The damage had already been done. Rick took a deep breath, his pride battling against the guilt weighing him down. He had made a terrible mistake, and there was no excuse for it. Slowly, he looked at Jordan, his voice lower, less harsh than before. "I was wrong," Rick admitted. "I shouldn't have accused you. I shouldn't have said those things. I let my own bias cloud my judgment, and I'm sorry." His eyes flickered with something close to regret. "I take back everything I said. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right." He sighed, running a hand over his face. "I can't change what I did, but I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." The room was silent. Everyone waited for Jordan to respond. He looked at Rick, really looked at him, and saw something different. The arrogance was gone. There was no smugness, no superiority, just a man who realized his mistake. Jordan took a deep breath and nodded. "I forgive you," he said simply. Everyone, even Commissioner Carter, seemed surprised. Rick looked up, almost in disbelief. "You do?" Jordan shrugged. "Yeah, because I'm the better person." His voice was calm but firm. "And I think you've learned your lesson." Rick had no words. He simply nodded, knowing deep down that Jordan was right. "What do you think about Jordan's decision to forgive Rick? After everything he went through, the false accusation, the insults, and the humiliation, do you think he made the right choice by forgiving him? Would you have done the same if you were in Jordan's shoes? Or do you believe some things shouldn't be forgiven so easily? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. This story is a powerful reminder of why we should never judge a book by its cover, or in this case, a person by the color of their skin. Rick let his prejudice control his actions, assuming the worst about Jordan simply because of who he was. Without any real proof, he was quick to label him a thief, a liar, and someone who didn't belong. But the truth proved him wrong. Jordan was innocent all along, and Rick's harsh words were based on nothing but his own biased beliefs. This shows how dangerous stereotypes can be. They blind us to the truth and make us treat people unfairly. In the end, Jordan showed real strength by choosing forgiveness. He understood that holding on to hate wouldn't change anything, but showing grace might. His actions teach us that character matters more than assumptions, and that people deserve to be seen for who they truly are, not for what others expect them to be. If you enjoyed this story and believe in standing against injustice, make sure to subscribe. Don't be like those who stay silent in the face of unfairness. Only people who are okay with injustice would not subscribe. But I know you're not one of them. So hit that subscribe button and be part of a community that values fairness, truth, and powerful storytelling.